My name is Jeremy, and this is Good Beer Matters.
We have this sort of party really hard thing, which has been documented back to the Viking Age, it's like 1,000 years ago. We had a law in Norway where if you had a farm, you had to brew. That was the law. But there's a pretty sort of divide between the beer interested people and those who are not.
I've never been to Norway, and honestly, I know very little about it. But I find that a curious mind is the key to exploring new beers, new cultures, and new friends. A beer and a question open the door to my next guest, who guides us through the beer culture of Norway. We find great experiences at the intersection of craft and culture. These are the stories of us, of great food and the beer that brings it all together. For the craft and culture of beer, this is episode 136 of Good Beer Matters with Sindre Ingebrigtsen. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are listening to this in the world or watching this in the world. We're continuing our travel, our virtual travel. Sadly, it has to be virtual, but until someone wants to fund my travels around the world to talk to people, then it's going to be virtual. But today we land in Norway with, it's funny how, Sindre, it's funny how we connect with people. Here we were in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm coming from the northwest of the U.S. and you're coming all the way from Norway, and you're very tall. I'm very tall, and I was just like a couple of guys, looking above everyone else's heads in the room and drinking a beer, like, "Hey, how's it going?" And next thing you know, we're talking about culture, we're talking about podcasting, we're talking about beer, and that led to this conversation today. So, cheers, my friend. It's nice to see you again, and welcome to the Good Beer Matters podcast.
Thank you, and cheers as well.
Cheers. Yes, it's morning for me, so yeah, I'm gonna let you enjoy. For the sake of everyone listening and watching, do me a favor, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about why you're talking about beer and your background and all that stuff.
So my name is Sindre. It's a pretty local name, I guess. It's from my knowledge only a name in Norway and Iceland. My journey sort of started in a strange way, I guess. I was never, to be honest, I didn't really like beer until I was in my early 30s, about 30 years old.
Same here.
Yeah.
Same here.
I went to New York and went into a bar, asked for a beer, which is what you do in Norway. You just get a cold beer, a lager type. We call them a Pilsner here, but it's technically not a Pilsner. We call them Norwegian Pilsners now, but they're a little different than what many people would call a Pilsner. Anyway, bartender looks at me strange. It's like, dude, we have 15 taps here. You got to be more specific. So I told him, like, I don't know, like, I'm used to like a lager. So he gave me an amber ale, and I think it was, I found out later, I think it was one called, is it Blue Moon or something? It's an American beer. But, and I was like, whoa, there's more, there's more to beer than just like ice cold macro lagers. And came back to Norway, started trying. So this is back in 2011. There weren't that many craft breweries. There were a few, but at the time, I guess we had the largest ones were Nøgne, which maybe some people in the United States know. They've been selling in the States for years, and also something called Håndbryggeriet. So I was trying these beers and got into homebrewing, just because the selection and also the prices, because we have some strange taxes. We can talk about that later in Norway when it comes to pricing on beer. But anyway, after a few years, at that time I was working in finance. I was working in the bank here in Norway. I'd started sort of realizing that I wasn't happy with my career choice. It was fine. It was nice people and everything, but I just didn't feel I fit in. So at a point there, I decided I want to work with beer. And how do I do that? I was getting quite good as a home brewer, but there are no brewing schools in Norway, so there's not like you can take that route. Um, so, this being 2016, I got the great idea to start a podcast because I at the time thought there were no other brewing podcasts in Norway. Right as I was recording my first episode, where I was lucky enough to meet this American guy. He wrote the American Sour Beers book. Can't remember his name on the top of my head.
Hmm.
Ended up talking to him in at this homebrew convention. Started the podcast. Kind of rocky start. It was sort of a steep learning curve. I had to learn how to do everything myself.
Yeah,
And
I can appreciate that.
yeah, that's that's it's luckily, like, I've played in bands for years, so it's started, like, I knew a little bit about recording, but not much.
Yeah,
And then right as I was recording my first episode, another I realized there were two other podcasts in Norway already. The other one dropped like their first episode just a couple of weeks before mine. And I didn't really know how to do it, but I ended up in a way as a home brewer talking to professional brewers on styles and how to brew and how home brewers could sort of what they could learn from professional brewers. Um, it was fun, but it took a lot of time. But then after a while, through some chance, my brother, who you met in Nashville as well,
yeah,
who
Paul.
runs, yeah, it was one of the founders of Plato, uh, which make great brew tech for those people who don't know that.
Yeah,
Um, he was talking to. He had another company at the time. He had a catering company. He was renting some place. He talked to the owner, and by chance, he told my brother that, hey, we're starting this contract brewing, and we need somebody to sort of be COO and head brewer. Uh, I call it head brewer because, well, technically it was a contract brewing thing, but they needed somebody who sort of knew the industry and knew people and could make the recipes. So contacted them, and a few months later, I got to quit my job in the bank and started working for Oslo Brewing, where I ended up staying for a few years in sort of changing roles. But um, that was my introduction to it. And yeah, I've never looked back since. I've sort of changed careers since that. I've worked for a few other breweries. Right now, I'm working in tourism, but I'm still in contact, and as I said, still part owner of also brewing. And yeah, I sort of keep a lookout for what's going on in the brewing industry in Norway, and it's still some of the best people met in my entire life. So,
well,
so
and
yeah,
I haven't met everyone
yeah,
in the brewing industry from Norway, but so far the
Mm,
people I've met in the brewing industry around the world are pretty solid folks. I can probably count on one hand people that I'd rather not spend any more time with. It's um,
yeah,
it's just it's like you mentioned, some of the brew or before we started recording, you mentioned some of the people in the craft area of Norway are still passion driven, just like
yeah,
we were in the States in beginning this craft beer movement. Now it's changed. Now it's becoming more of a commodity, more of a business, viable business, and so there's still passion, but there's passion and a bottom line, and that kind of overlaps. But um, So, Sindre,
Mm.
I've admitted to you, I've never been to Norway. I've never been to Northern Europe, to be, other than England. But that's kind of a different story. Um, I got to ask you just a basic fundamental question. How would you describe uh, Norwegian culture for the rest of us who haven't been there?
Well, it's a big question, I guess, but
Sorry, but
um,
I just kind of set the scene. I mean, when we start talking more about beer in particularly Norway, what's the backstory? What do we need to know to go into this?
well, sort of, it's a big. I'd say it's a sort of a mix now because historically, for thousands of years, probably, beer has been a huge part of Norwegian culture. As many people probably know, we have the kveik, which is sort of the
Hmm.
Norwegian farmhouse yeast, which has gotten like a huge renaissance now. Which so go back a few hundred years. We had a law in Norway that I think it was called the Gulating law, where if you had a farm, you had to brew. That was the law, and this is probably to do with the fact that people got sick from drinking water, and you didn't get sick from drinking beer. So so you had to brew, and there was even a taxation for this. Can't say for certain when this was, but I do believe it was that if you get caught 1 year not brewing, you get a huge tax increase, and if you get caught, I think second or third time, you'll lose your farm. So so it's been always been a huge part, but then I guess like with the rest of the world in the well, Norway also had prohibition in the early 1900s, and
Oh,
but these farms, they were so. I mean, Norway is it's a really long and a hilly country, so so we have all of these places where they only met each other. It's like small places. You didn't really travel outside of these areas, so so I think that's part of the reason why, for as for many other countries, the farmhouse brewing sort of died out, both because of price. It's easier to get these sort of industrially produced beers. They get cheaper, but it sort of stayed in Norway, and I can't say for certain how many, but as one of the few countries in the world, I guess there was Estonia and Lithuania, Finland, Russia, some other countries that where they have still found some of these similar cultures. Turns out that probably all of Europe had these things, but for some reason it's sort of kept in Norway, and this might have to do has to do with just the fact that you have all of these small villages that are sort of it's hard to get to, and I mean you can't just make a road through a mountain. I mean you can do you can make
well,
tunnels
we do
now,
that all
but
the time in the U.S. I don't know what you're
yeah,
talking
yeah,
about.
but I mean
Just kidding.
and no, it's fine. It's like we do a lot of tunnels. I mean, if you drive in Norway, you will. I think we still have the longest tunnel in the world here. So
Oh,
it's
really?
yeah, yeah. It's I think it's like 42 kilometers. It's
Oh, wow.
crazy. But the interesting thing is that I think it was like in the 1990s that homebrewing got legal again from before prohibition. But during this time, all of these farmers that just kept up brewing. So beer has always been a huge part. Like it's I guess it's different for us because of the climate. Um, like we have this sort of party really hard thing, which has been documented back to the Viking Age, it's like 1,000 years ago. So Norway is sort of a strange country. It can come across as cold. Like if you come here, people they won't like when I go to the United States, for instance, it's strange for me that somebody next to me at a bar, if I'm there alone, they'll start talking to me. That I mean, if people are drunk enough, it will happen, of course. But I
Yeah.
mean, in Norway, that's not a thing. But because that's sort of a culture thing where you respect other people's privacy in that you don't talk to them, which is, I mean, for many it can come across as strange, but for us,
Which begs
it's
the
just.
question: how do you meet
Mhm.
each other and become friends? How do you meet, people you want to go on a date with? I mean, if it's just like, okay, well, I'm not going to talk to you, then how do you hook up? It's
Well, I mean, of course, that's a whole different scene. I mean, that's why people drink, because when you
I was
drink,
going to
you
say
you
the
talk.
answer is
Yeah,
alcohol.
yeah, that's alcohol. That's at least a huge part of it, at least from before dating apps and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I guess a lot of it is that was our sort of social lubricant. I guess it's a word I've heard. And I mean, it's kind of interesting because it's fun. I mean, people on the street won't really talk to each other, but if you're a tourist in Norway and you get lost or something happens, and I mean, you just ask somebody, and like 9 times out of 10, they'll people like go out of the way to try to help you, because that's also a part of it. Like, you help each other, but you respect each other's privacy. So it's sort of it can come across as strange for many people. I get that, but
Okay.
it's I I have to say I love it in the States whenever I'm there, but at times it can get a little bit like all of the courtesy is strange for us. Not that we're not I mean, nice to each other and polite, but it's a whole different thing.
Interesting.
But yeah.
So, and so you kind of talked, and thank you for talking a little bit about the history. That was on my to-do list to ask you about. But
Mhm.
fast forward to today. You mentioned the 1990s. Homebrewing was made legal in Norway.
Mm.
Um, so tell us about the craft beer in Norway. What's the short history of that, and what's the state of craft beer in Norway today?
Well, I think so. The first craft brewery in Norway was actually it's still going. It's a place called Oslo Microbrewery, and they started in the late '80s actually, because they weren't homebrewers. They started, I think it was '88 or something. I think their slogan is "We were started before it was cool" or something. So they're
Uh-huh.
still going and make some great beers and have a really nice tap room in Oslo if you're ever here. And um, going forward from that, there may have been some small other breweries, but I think there are two breweries that started pretty early. I guess Nøgnø being one of them, where hope I'm not butchering this history, but from my recollection, he was Kjetil Likun who started it. He was a pilot, and he would fly to the United States. Um, and being the pilot, he could bring some extra stuff on board. So he would bring homebrew equipment. He would buy everything in the States and bring it back, and then homebrew. And then in the early 2000s, he started the craft brewery Nøgnø, and soon behind followed a brewery called Holmbryggeriet, and these breweries are still going and have grown to pretty large breweries, and now I guess I think we're at about 200 breweries in Norway, craft breweries, which for a country with 5 million people is pretty good. And I mean, they're
Good to be
spread
a brewery.
from. Yeah, I mean, they're spread like there's even a brewery at Svalbard, so it's all over the country, and I guess it's doing good. But I think the pandemic has sort of hit breweries in a different way, because as I was saying, we have this sort of taxation system in Norway. We have a national sales monopoly on alcohol in Norway. So anything above 4.7% has to be sold in a state-owned specialty shop.
Okay.
Yeah. So most of our beers, sort of what we call like regular, we call it store beer, which is sort of a sentence because that's beer at 4.7%. So I guess for those who were producing, packaging, and selling in stores during the pandemic, they had a huge upswing. They would sell, because people were just sitting at home getting drunk for for however long. So those breweries, a lot of them did really good. But then those who were more depending on sales in bars and restaurants and places like that, they would took a pretty big hit. So
Yeah.
so we have lost a few breweries, but I think it's slowly getting better. And I mean, you still have we still have some really good beer festivals. I think the largest one is in Bergen, and brings in like, I think 20,000 people over a weekend, which is pretty good.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so I would say craft beer is doing really good, but I guess like as you can say, like if you say like the craft beer movement started in the U.S. in the early '80s, we're like 20 years behind. So, so I would say
Does
that
that
we're sort of.
correlate too with just the quality and the innovation, and everything that you guys are doing? Is that to say that where you guys are is where we were 20 years ago?
I think I think with the internet, of course, and the fact that you will find a lot of like highly educated, really good brewers that come to Norway from Brazil, from the States, from Canada. So in the last, I'd say 5 to 10 years, it's had a massive growth, and I mean it's a huge fun and sort of diverse industry, and I'd say the quality is catching up, but overall, not to sort of speak badly of anyone, but it's a little bit different whenever you come to the States. It's like I think, for instance, one thing um, that I see is getting a lot better. It's sort of a consistency, for instance, that you'd a few years ago it would be sometimes you'd like really taste the difference between batches, and
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
So, but I think, yes, I said the last 5-10 years we've had an amazing growth in these areas. So the professionality and uh, what you said, diversion and everything, and all of the different kinds of beers, it's catching up, I would say. But
So,
yeah.
so then, yeah, when you travel around other parts of the world, and obviously when you were in the U.S. Just a few months ago,
Mm.
what are the big differences? I mean, you mentioned, okay, the quality of beer is one thing, but what do you notice about the drinking culture, the beer culture, the everything surrounding the beer and everything else? What do you notice is just different? Whether not necessarily good or bad, but what's just different between other cultures and what you guys have in Norway?
Well, one of the things is that Norway has this. I mean, it's getting better, and it's better in the larger cities like in Oslo and Bergen and Trondheim and so on. It is that thing with sort of when you drink, because for years, like if you went out, like if, and I guess in a few small towns still, if you go out on a Tuesday evening to have a few beers, it's sort of frowned upon because you drink in the weekends, and
Okay, interesting.
but but I mean, if you go to in Oslo now, it's I mean, all of the, like, we have a lot of really good beer bars in Oslo, and this has changed a lot during the last few years, but And then also it's a difference where, for instance, like coming back to, as I said, with the how the legality of selling beer. Like for instance, the as I said, we have the 4.7% rule, where breweries aren't allowed to sell. Like they need a special license to sell their own beer, where there are some strange rules where you can't be the same building, or it can be the same building as the brewery, but there has to be, I think, like two doors in between it. So there are some strange rules. I've sat like I've done some of these applications in the past, and they're crazy. Where you have to draw up like, okay, here's the brewery, here's the door, and then you can only sell 4.7% and below at the brewery. Everything else you has to go through the wine monopoly, as it's called.
Yeah.
So so that's a different thing, because I guess seeing, and I've seen this in other countries, like you'll go to a bar, you'll maybe go to the tap room, you'll have a few beers, and then you'll buy a few six packs or a case and bring it home.
Yeah.
That's, I mean, you could do it at some places, but then again, you're never going to leave with anything stronger than a 4.7% beer. So that's a different thing. And but then again, I think it's catching up, and that's sort of a thing. We've had this thing for years also, that many of the larger breweries, they might be so far outside of town that it's sort of hard to get there. So like you'd come into a tap room. I've done this, and like breweries will have a tap room where they can actually sell their stronger beer to you in the glass, because they have a bar license. Uh, but you might be the only person there. So it's and it's sort of like, I guess, in a way, I guess brewing culture and breweries are, at least in the States, is a little bit cooler than in Norway. In Norway, it's more like, oh, you're a brewer. Okay. It's not like, I think it has more like, I think, yeah, you're looked at as a little bit cooler in the States if you're a brewer than in
I
Norway.
is a brewer in Norway just kind of a common blue collar job or something along those lines?
I think, yeah, people think so. Or I mean,
Interesting.
if you're in the industry, and I mean, I like to say we, but I guess I'm not like working in it anymore. But
I do
it's
that all the
it's
time.
yeah, but we know each other, and I mean, that guy's really good. That guy, that girl, like people are really good at brewing, and they're sort of respected. But nobody, like the regular beer drinker, would not have like that thing, sort of like. But then again, I
So are they not appreciated as an artisan, as someone who's creating something elevated, like a chef? I mean, how are chefs regarded in Norway? Like the good high end chefs?
yeah, I think it's falling a little bit behind, and then it's also
Mm,
the thing that maybe wine is it's sort of looked upon as sort of more highbrow in a way.
yeah.
It's kind of funny, like for instance with we have all of these in like the newspapers. You have these people that are wine tasters, and then they'll give their recommendation, and then people will buy wine depending on that.
Hmm.
In Norway, it's a lot of like untapped, and people in Norway, they rate things in a strange way. Like you can never, like a lager will never get more than three. Like it could be the best lager you've ever tasted. Um, like for instance, the Molo that I used to work for before in Olesen, they have a Helles that won gold medal in the European Championship, brewing championship last year.
Wow. Wow.
and
Impressive.
and I guess on Untapped now, it's a Hallelujah Helles. It's still one of my favorite beers. It's a fantastic beer, and they also have this really good Pilsner called Instant Hero that won silver in the German Pilsner. So they're like really good.
Legit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like really, like it's not just me having worked there and knowing the brewers. It's and I mean, it won't have a higher rating than a three, because in Norway, a pilsner can never be as good as a crazy IPA or sour or stout. Or so I feel like there's less sort of style recognition in a way.
So it sounds like you're painting a picture, and I'm going to try and interpret it
Mm,
from my end. And is that just the general understanding, the general knowledge and education about beer is leading to a under appreciation for that stuff? Because I think you and I both know that a good Helles is
mm,
way harder to brew
yeah,
than a lactic sour or an IPA or a
yeah,
bourbon barrel aged anything. It's like to get a good Helles that's clean and just beautiful and perfect is is a feat of mastery. And
yeah. And
so
then that
it's
is, yeah, that's and I still love it. That was the or is the brewmaster's or baby, that beer he's been working on for years, and to win that
oh
was,
god,
I mean, amazing.
oh man,
And but I think like people are, I think the common sort of knowledge of brewing in Norway is pretty low. I mean, people think, oh, you just, you throw it together and then it's done. I
mm,
think it's not. But then again, that comes from years of just only having these. I call them macro, but I guess like in in comparison to the states, they're still
yeah,
small. But sort of the like the big brands in Norway. It's never been sort of a huge thing about. Well, for one, you can't advertise alcohol in Norway. It's forbidden. You can't advertise alcohol at all, not on social media, not anywhere. I
oh
mean, you can barely write on your homepage what you produce. You can only like sort of the smallest minute details are legal, and you can get into pretty big problems if you do it.
Well, that
So
explains when I was researching, this, I found you on the Molo website,
mm,
and I wasn't quite sure what Molo was until I dug a little bit deeper, and so
yeah,
that makes sense.
yeah, because it's so the laws are really strict, and I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm actually like I wouldn't. I'm happy that we don't have like huge sides of buildings with these alcohols and spirits,
Yes.
and so
Yeah.
I like that our sort of, what do you call it, Bibil, like the our cities are a little bit cleaner from advertising that way, and also TV. But it sort of makes it harder because, for instance, like all of these larger breweries, they'll have their trucks going around, and sort of in Norway we call like the major brands, you just call them by the brewery name. Like I'll have one of that or one of that or one of that, and then everybody knows it's a Norway, it's a pilsner.
Okay.
So that's sort of the thing. It's like I guess also in Norway, it's people are more interested in the drinking than sort of the creation. So,
Interesting. Well, so
mm,
let me ask you this. So when a group of Norwegians go out together and or we're gonna meet at the bar, we're gonna meet at the brewery, we're gonna
mm,
go out, we're gonna drink.
yeah.
What does that look like? Are you going out to eat and drink? Are you going out to just drink and solve all the problems of the world? Or what happens in that environment of a bunch of Norwegians going out to drink?
Well, there's, I guess, so we have a couple of different sayings for this. So if you're gonna go drinking, the usual thing, I guess, or at least if you're a little younger, let's say you're a student, let's say you're in your 20s, the usual thing to do, unless there's a student bar where the alcohol is really cheap, then people will meet up at somebody's apartment or in the park. And summertime, you'll buy the beers in the store, you'll drink beers, and then you'll go out and have a few beers on the town, because those are expensive. So it's a lot cheaper. Like I guess, like buying the standard lager is 4 or 5 times the price if you're going to go to a bar.
Wow.
So, well, depending on where you go, I mean, it's a huge difference if you go to a student bar or if you go to like a really fancy place. But um, And then of course there's the dinner, but then I have a feeling it's more like wine is more. It's getting there with beer. I mean, you're getting restaurants, like good restaurants that have a beer pairings, and or for instance, you'll go to a good restaurant that has, like, you'll get a meal and they have a beer, they have a cider, which we have a huge cider production in Norway, which is really good as well. And then and they'll sort of mix it all up. But I guess it's I guess as you get older you'll go for the dinner and the drinking, but
Yeah. Yeah.
but there's a thing, like we call it foreplay actually, which is when you go to somebody's apartment and you drink, like you go to the store or to the wine monopoly and get a bottle of wine, and then you get kind of drunk or kind of tipsy, and then you go out to town. So people won't be out like on Fridays and Saturdays in at least smaller places, and to some extent in Oslo, it's like people won't go out until 12, and then everything closes at 3 at the latest, I guess, in Norway. So we have really strict rules about most things that has to do with alcohol. So so
Gotcha.
it's different, and I mean it's But then again, I guess the sort of the home party is sort of always going to be a big part of it. It's
And so do people, you mentioned when you're out in a bar or restaurant that people just kind of respect each other's space, so they're less likely to interrupt or start talking, but I would assume that when you're at
yeah,
someone's house, you know each other, so it is a lot more conviviality there?
yeah, and I mean it's sort of a thing. Like I guess it's the same all over. It's like you might be like a group of friends, and then like somebody will invite somebody and somebody, and then you'll be a group of people that might never have met each other. But then of course you have the alcohol. Sorry, there's something. And then yeah, you have the alcohol, and then it's easier. And of course, I guess like if you're in a crowded bar, it's like easier to like start talking to somebody next to you, or so it's a whole different thing. I guess that's the whole thing. Is like you will it's easier to get talking to people on a Saturday or Friday evening in Norway than the
Gotcha.
rest of the week. Yeah.
Well, then, talk to me a little bit about, you mentioned that, you've got your, Norwegian Pilsner, which is kind of
Mm.
your basic, store beer,
Yeah.
and then you've also mentioned that, you've got the, Kveik, farmhouse beers.
Yeah.
Talk to me about Norwegian styles, of beer. What characterizes the beer coming from Norway?
Um, well, we can start with the sort of the Pilsner, as I said. It's close to a German Pilsner, but sometimes I'd say usually a little bit sweeter,
Mm,
a little bit less bitter, and a little bit darker. Not much. It's still like a pale lager,
kinda
but
getting a little bit more golden.
yeah, usually it's
Mm,
sort of golden colored. And then of course we have the farmhouse beers, but they are more of a speciality. There's not not a huge thing. I guess in Norway, like the big thing for many years in Norway was, for instance, the Hefeweizens, like the German Hefeweizens.
yeah,
That's always been a huge and it's still a thing. It's easier to get a Hefeweizen at like small places than to get an IPA, or well, IPAs are getting there, I guess. But now that people can have them in bottles and cans, and the macro breweries are starting to making their versions of it. So yeah, and then you have that sort of farmhouse ale that's usually a little bit darker, a little bit more smoky, but they're not. I I not really say it's sort of a huge part of the culture. I guess like Pilsner is the the biggest one by far, and of course there's always been sort of a culture for darker beers. But for most people, if you're outside of the beer industry, there's a mango IPA, and there's
Really?
oh yeah, the mango IPA is like the biggest thing in Norway right now,
Which
and
those are
it's
amazing, but, that's something I'd expect to find in India or, Southeast Asia or
yeah,
something like that.
yeah, but if you'd put one of the macro mango IPAs in front of me, I would not call that even an IPA, not even close.
Okay.
It'll have maybe spices in it. I'd say it's a hef with some hops and mango essence or flavor. Like, of course, there are some craft breweries that are making some amazing mango IPAs, but it's become, I think, for people outside of the sort of the nerdy beer crowd, that's the thing. It's like it's German style, maybe some Belgian like light beers, and then yeah, it's like German and Belgian beers have always been kind of big, and it's easy to get. Like, we can get a lot of like really good sours, Belgian sours, just because we have that sort of, it's been imported for years.
Mhm. Yeah.
But um yeah, it's not, it's like still, even at the wine monopoly, like some of the most selling beers are still just like the high alcohol lagers. So I'd say so it's like two different worlds in a way. It's but it's getting there. I mean, it's every year it's getting more and more. It's easier. I mean, you have a larger selection. I mean, you it's almost hard now to go to a bar that, I mean, unless they only have one tap of Pilsner, to not get at least an IPA and a sour maybe. Or so I guess the craft beer crowd is growing, but there's a pretty like sort of divide between the beer interested people and those who are not.
Interesting.
Mm,
Interesting. Um, sorry, I'm just write that little note down.
mm,
Uh, so if I were to ask you to predict the future of Norwegian beer, let's go out 5 years, 10 years. Where do you think we're going to end up?
mm. Well, um I hope we'll see some legislation that lets, for instance, the breweries have brewery sales where they can sell freshly packaged beer. We've had some change recently where cider producers are allowed to do that, but at the point it has to do with the sort of what you put into the what you put into the beverage has to be made on the farm, sort of on the spot.
Mhm.
And with the I mean, in Norway now, the only way you could do that is set up a brewery at one of the few malting houses in Norway, which there are not too many of yet still. Or, I mean, we have some good ones, but um, so I hope we'll get some more, like the legislation there, that could have been a lot better, and also makes it easier because, I mean, traveling around the country, what's better than sort of tasting a good beer and then buying a six pack and taking it with you home? Um, I I think Norway is pretty diverse. I mean, IPAs are big and sours are big, and but I think what I what I think we'll see is more and more sort of a scientific approach, um, more data being taken. I'm thinking more more or less like in the way where, um, as I see in the United States, it's people are sort of it's a science. It's going a little bit from being a craft to being a science in a way, and
Yeah.
I guess I'd like to see that. I mean, still keeping the craft part, but and
That's a hard balance of keeping that passion, that artistry, which
yeah,
kind of within that nature
mm,
begets this inconsistency. Because what if I'm having an off day and I'm brewing and doesn't come out quite the same? And
yeah,
but having that scientific approach just kind of by its inherent aptitude. It just takes that passion out of it because we're being very, very objective about it.
Yeah.
So having that balance is kind of nice.
Yeah, I think so too. And the thing is that Norway is pretty free when it comes to sort of experimentation. I think we're at a good spot when it comes to like, there's a huge range of really good beers you can get in Norway, like anything from like the lightest light beers to the heaviest barrel aged, crazy imperial stouts. And I mean, there's always going to be trends, and I've, to be honest, never been too good at reading trends. It's sort of a thing because I'm more, um, I guess I'd say I'm more interested in what I like, and then,
Yeah.
but but I think sort of like it'll just keep going, and I see one of the good things in Norway, and I guess it's the same all over. It's like you have all of these breweries doing collaborations and working together, and people like you will work at one brewery, move to the next, and then you'll take some of the things you learn at the first brewery, take it to the next. Uh, I it's sort of hard to say. I can't really. I think more or less it has to do with the loss. And then, of course, I hope that for I hope that people are going to see that there is like for there are some breweries that have their sort of patrons, but um, it would be nice to see a little bit more money going into the production side. Um, it's hard to get backers to start a brewery right now, and
It sounds like the
yeah,
problem is systemic. We need the consumers to have a better education and appreciation of it so that they
yeah,
will go out and buy more. So then in turn, we have to raise the quality and consistency and interest in the beer. You kind of have a chicken the egg situation going on where it's, well, they're both going to feed on each other, but someone has to kick it off. And
yeah.
it sounds like you have effectively kicked it off, but it's not exploding. Which, in all fairness, in the U.S., we talk about the three waves of the craft beer movement. The beginning, it started in the '80s, and most breweries fell off. Then in the '90s, they tried another kind of a big expansion. Most of those fell off. It was in the 2000s, and I remember the 2000s in particular, where it was like we finally got some traction. We were finally building momentum, and then the 2000 teens, it just exploded. But it took the '80s, the '90s, and the 2000s to really create that foundation.
Yeah. And like sort of the craft movement and homebrewing everything is still like, I'd say in its late teens in Norway. So
Yeah.
it's like it's not been many years. So I think it just has to grow a little bit. It just has to sort of evolve into its own thing and kind of separate in a way from sort of the public view that the people don't know how much work goes into making beer. And I find it extremely funny whenever I have a beer tour or had a beer tour in the past. Of course, you'll always have some homebrewers ask some questions, and because I mean, on these beer tours, there's always sort of like interested people. But then you'll talk to people who were like, "Oh, I had no idea that it was like this much work. I thought it was like people don't really know how much work it is, and like I said, people don't know, especially for craft breweries, how much it takes to like make a really really good lager. That's amazing amount of work. And like making a good IPA, of course, you have to do the water, you have to do the hops right, you have to do the balance and everything. But time wise and I mean it's an easier beer to make, and sometimes I wish that I wish that more people knew that, and that's one of the things that I would try to sort of to let people know whenever I'm talking about beer. So,
Well, then
mm,
good. It's, I mean,
mm,
to get that out there and help the more people that understand that, oh, like I remember when I was younger, I remember the day that I walked into a store where I used to go get cigars and wine and whatever it was. I remember walking in and seeing this box, and it was like a homebrew kit. And I
mm,
remember thinking, oh, you can brew beer at home? Because I always assumed that beer was made in some factory somewhere.
yeah,
Just like cars are made in a no one makes a car in there. Well, people will restore cars, but no one's just like, you know what? I'm going to build a new car in my garage. It was just like cars are made in a factory. To me, that's what brewing was, made in some factory somewhere with behind the green curtain, and with the magical wizard was doing something. I remember thinking, "Oh my gosh, you can actually brew beer at home." And so that was my little brush with destiny, and then I just moved on and dismissed it altogether. But I think about that from time to time as I've become a home brewer, as I've gotten into the beer industry. I remember thinking that people need to understand that there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of steps and people that, from growing the hops and the barley and everything else, that there's so much that goes into just that one glass that people sit down and take for granted.
yeah, yeah. And I think that's yeah, it's a good explanation for what people think in Norway. I mean, one thing we've had the last 10 years, we've had a huge sort of growth in homebrewing.
Mm,
So there's a
cool.
lot of like there's some really large like homebrewing competitions, and I was just thinking like I randomly remembered now that my first homebrew kit I bought from Nøgnø, from the craft. They started selling it, and Kjetil Ikun, the guy who started it, he hand delivered it to my door in the building next to where I'm living now. Back in, I guess, 10 years ago, I guess, and it started there, and so it's pretty great. Like we've had some. That's the thing. Like the largest homebrew shop in Europe that was located just like 20-minute walk from where I live now, that actually went bankrupt a few weeks ago.
Oh no.
So there's some uncertainty now around that. But from I did a little digging, and it looks like it's sort of the it got bought up by another brew shop. So I guess we're good. But us living in Oslo, who used to have, as I said, the biggest brew shop in Europe, we don't have any. There might be some. I can't say for sure. I haven't had much time for homebrewing in the
Yeah, fair
last few
enough.
years, but no, it's
Well,
interesting, and it helps. Homebrewing helps a lot. Mm,
well, let's wind stuff down a little bit.
mm,
So tomorrow, you
mm,
get to become the king of the beer world for one day.
mm.
What would be one thing that you would change about beer around the globe?
Oh, around the globe. Um, well, there's one thing I think. I know this is a sort of a regular one, but I think ownership is sort of um, a big thing. Like you have a lot of huge companies buying up breweries. I mean, it's not necessarily all bad, but the control. Luckily, in Norway, I know that we have it's sort of pretty free, but then again, it's for smaller breweries. It's hard to get into a bar because the larger macros will have sort of made behind like backroom deals with the bars that are not
Mm,
technically legal. Like I'd like to see sort of a, a freer independent market. I mean, even I mean some some sort of state funding for people with good companies and good company plans. Just because I guess with like so many other things, we are losing out on people. Like for what you know, there's some person sitting like homebrewing right now that has a recipe that would like revolutionize like the
Yeah.
new IPA, the New England IPA. But you can't really just like, yeah, here you go.
Yeah.
I like it for to be more open. It's I guess with the sort of the big homebrew competitions, that's getting sort of better. But I think it's like sort of the competition thing where you have these huge companies that are owning like how many percent of the beer industry. I'd love to see that sort of like some stricter rules all over the country or all over the world for that matter. So we don't have to sort of, because I'm afraid that if you go sort of that route, like it's the illusion of choice
Yeah.
where suddenly like the
Because
big companies still,
we end up with factory beer.
yeah, and then you'll see like your favorite beer because it doesn't sell a million barrels a year, that'll disappear. And then so I think what I love right now is the diversity and the sort of the openness, and I just like to see that getting better instead of worse. So
Yeah.
that's sort of one thing I'd say.
Well, at
So
the end of your Royal Beer Day, we're going to
mm.
send you anywhere on Earth to have a beer and a meal. Where would you go and what would you have?
Ooh, that's hard. Hmm. I I'd probably say Reykjavik, Iceland. So I have my mother is Icelandic, so I grew up going there every other summer, and I speak Icelandic to a small degree, I guess. But there is something I love about that country that is different and strange, and the food, and they have some amazing restaurants, and it's one of the places I keep going back to. So I think I'd have to say there.
So, what would you eat
Uh,
and what would you drink?
ooh, um, so that's the thing. Like I'm more into like yes, I have the things that I like to eat. I have the things that but I'm more into that thing where you just okay. So let's say you have a restaurant you love, and then okay, today we have a 5 course menu.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm I like better to be sort of surprised and amazed than to sort of go back and eat the same thing and same thing. And I think for me, that's part of living. It's going around the world and eating and drinking and trying new things. And I'm trying to remember the name of this restaurant right now that I've been to many times in Iceland, but I can't I can't
Yeah.
remember
Because
it
you're on the
right now.
spot.
Yeah. um,
Well,
mm,
then the other big question I have for you from your experiences is why does good beer matter so much to you?
hmm. I think it's a whole. It's the fact that I mean, beer can be pretty easy. It can be homebrewing on a really small, tiny scale on your stovetop, um, and it can get pretty good. And then you can go from that, and you can go into the huge science, and you can get into these like hour-long discussions, and it's tasting notes, and I mean beer is it has hundreds of more tasting notes than wine, for instance.
Hmm.
It's just a complexity. It's the vastness. It's like it never gets boring because there's always going to be something new. There's always going to be somebody that develops something new, a new taste, a new combination, puts something in the beer. It's I feel it's an evolving, and I mean the more you get into the science, yeah, it never gets boring. It is just always. And then at the end of the day, it's fun to have a beer with your friends. So it's both like extremely complex and huge and big, and at the same time, it's easy and it's fun, and it's this like really nice little thing that brings us all together. So
Yeah.
yeah, I guess that would that would be it.
Perfect.
Mm.
And then a couple easy questions. For anyone
Mhm.
who wants to learn more about Norwegian beer or travel through Norway, where could they go?
Um, well, we have some good, of course, we have some really good bars in Oslo. I'd sort of start here. If you want to travel for beer, I'd recommend you fly into Oslo and then
Well, I'm
go from
thinking
here.
more
But
more like websites or something like that. How could they learn before they get there?
uh, well, that is not necessarily. We don't have. Um,
Gotcha.
I guess most of them are Norwegian in Norwegian. So finding, to my knowledge, right now, I don't know if there's a good sort of tourist site or place to go. Um,
Well, great. Then anyone who's
yeah,
who's listening, who's like, "Oh, I can help with that." There's an opportunity to get information out there, not only to Norwegians about beer, but about Norwegian beer and travel to the rest of the world. So,
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I
Uh,
think a lot of tourists are using Untapped and and I mean just Google Maps, I guess. So
well, area of
mm,
opportunity.
yeah.
Do you have any final words to say to anyone watching or listening?
Um, Yeah, there's one thing I wanted to sort of go back on, and I've said, for instance, about Norway, we have a lot of rules. That's sort of the thing that feel like it has come across. But the one thing I'd like to say is sort of give a little positive at the end because it might have sounded like I'm not that keen with what we call the Vine monopoly here in Norway, which is sort of the state owned stores there where you have to
Hmm.
go to buy anything above 4.7%. However, I think it's a really really good concept because this makes it so that almost every small little area town they'll be within driving distance of one of these stores, and they are the second largest purchaser of alcohol in the world because it sort of serves 5 million people in Norway. And the great thing about it is that if you live like far north in the bottom of fjord, you can go online, you can order the strangest, newest, craziest beer and wine and everything, and you can have it delivered to that store to no extra cost, and everything is set. The cost, there's no, they'll just add on the taxes, which is the same for everyone. So we have like wine collectors coming from France to buy French wine and then taking it back because they'll purchase so much and it's cheaper for them to buy it in Norway and import it back into France than to buy it in France because they're the sort of the middleman will put on
Yeah,
the extra price. Yeah.
yeah,
So even though it's might sound a little strange, I mean, I think it's a really, really good system, and it sort of gives everybody the same playing field. Like you don't have to travel to Oslo or travel to any of the big cities or to get if you want something really special or not special at all, but you sort of the price and everything is set all over the country, which I think is it's a really good concept, and it also helps spread because you can like if you get into the wine monopoly with a beer, then you can sell it anywhere in the country and it's easy for people. You can just
yeah.
they can order, I mean, sometimes they'll have to order a six pack, but I mean, it's a good thing, and I really think it's at the end of the day it's a huge help for spreading like good beer around the country.
Because good beer matters. So,
Yeah, right, it does.
well, Sindre, it was
Mm,
so nice meeting you in Nashville and just having
mm.
that great conversation. I appreciate you coming on to the podcast and sharing with us just a little, pun intended, a little taste of Norway. And
Yeah,
I hope that we will all find our way there and just kind of discover it for ourselves. But I appreciate you coming on and sharing all of this.
yeah, thank you as well. It's been been really nice, and yeah, come to Norway. It is beautiful. It can be
Yeah.
really bad and cold weather, but right now it's hot as hell.
Well, well, when if and when I can make it to Norway, I'm going to plan on summertime because I don't think
Yeah,
I'm
I
man
think
enough to
that.
endure a Norwegian winter. But that's a different story. Anyway,
Mm.
thank you.
Thank you as well.
Every culture has a beer culture, even the ones who aren't known for their beer. This is because every country has beer, and every beer can open a door to a world we haven't experienced before. Keep your mind curious, grab yourself a beer and a bite to eat, and go explore. In the next episode, we head back to Latin America, except this time we learn about beer culture from a local. I'm on a virtual tour of the craft and culture of beer around the globe. I've put Good Beer Matters on video so I can take you along for the ride. If you know of a person, a place, or a beer story that needs to be told, let me know. Meanwhile, grab a beer, hang out with friends, and let your world open up. Thank you for listening. Cheers.